Hello, welcome to our first meeting of the Fireside Chat with Lyndon Larouche for the year 2023, Thursday, January 5th. Tonight, and we're going to get right into our discussion, we will be discussing keying our discussion off a paper of Lyndon Larouche called Jesus Christ and Civilization, which Gerry will be speaking about in a certain way. Of course, there are various events that are surrounding us, but in terms of what our organization is actually up to, we want to be clear about a few things. We have this coming Sunday an event that Diane Fair, an independent candidate for U.S. Senate in 2024 in the state of New York, will be convening. She's convening it as a policy forum. So the intent is not that the persons that are speaking are necessarily endorsing her campaign. They're there for the purpose of engaging in a policy discussion, essentially as a kind of where do we go from here? Meaning where does the planet go from here? One element which we want to call attention to at the very beginning of tonight is that there will be at least the Russians have proposed, Vladimir Putin has proposed, and decreed that there shall be a ceasefire Christmas Day, January 7th. I believe it begins at, I don't know if it's at 12. I'm not sure if that meant 12 noon on January 6th, or maybe 12 midnight January 6th through 12 midnight January 7th. January 7th is Christmas Day in the Orthodox Christian tradition. We're talking about Russia, we're talking about the Armenian church, the Ukrainian church, and so on. Now, as many of you who've been involved in our mobilization for the last period know, we've been calling for that. The concept being that our work at the churches, much of it had been focused on some of the Catholic churches, but nonetheless our work was to encourage people to sing the Dona Nobis Pacem, or Grant Us Peace, and to make this a kind of generic universal, national, international anthem for all of those persons that were going to devote themselves to the process of demanding a peace. That's an important thing to understand that we're doing, but that has now happened in the case of Russia. So that should first of all be stated for what it is. We want to recognize that, not minimize that. Our organization and its work played a critical role in that. So that's something that we first of all just want to make sure we state and make clear. I wanted to that's this Sunday, January 8th. Then on Saturday, January 14th, we'll be holding an event as well, which has the preliminary title. The title may be a little bit different because we are trying to make sure we emphasize some elements of King, but it's going to say, to stop NATO's world war, dismantle the JFK International Assassination Bureau. As I say, the title may be slightly different. Speakers now involved will be Ray McGovern, talk show host Garland Nixon, and Helga Zepp LaRouche, among others. Now, this is our attempt to make our voices clearly heard, not to take up what people are trying to take up about getting the JFK assassination files to see whether the CIA killed the president. We are starting with a much different premise, that there is an international assassination bureau, that it is directed by multiple intelligence agencies with the hand of, you guessed it, British intelligence being very prominent. And we are going to make sure to feature that element, though that will not be the exclusive element of that discussion. That will be Saturday starting at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 10 a.m. And will be, in effect, the Manhattan, the meeting of that we usually do on Saturday will be supplanted by this. It will be a Schiller Institute event. And then we will be having probably, we believe, the February 4th and 5th. That date is subject to change, but will be finalizing that, and probably on Saturday. There will be an International Schiller Institute conference to further consolidate the discussion of the 10 principles that everybody has received. So those are the basic things that are coming up, and I think the only thing I'd like to do in introducing Gerry is something that we've tried to do concerning Martin Luther King over time, which is to try to emphasize that he was not a political figure. It's wrong to try to understand King from that standpoint, because you never understand what he did. And that, of course, is why a lot of people say, well, I actually disagree with his tactics about creative nonviolent direct action, because they don't understand how he arrived at it. And you can't embrace what he was doing unless you start from his standpoint. This is not that I'm saying everybody has to start from King's standpoint, but unless you look at how he thought about it, then you can't understand what it was that King was thinking to accomplish and why he was successful. So I'm going to read something from the book Strength to Love, written by King, but this is a very particular, and many of these things are sermons, which are a collection, really. And this one is called Our God is Able. And so he says this: at the center of the Christian faith is the conviction that in the universe there is a God of power who is able to do exceedingly abundant things in nature and in history. This conviction is stressed over and over in the Old and the New Testaments. Theologically, this affirmation is expressed in the doctrine of the omnipotence of God. The God whom we worship is not a weak and incompetent God. He is able to beat back gigantic waves of opposition and to bring low prodigious mountains of evil. The ringing testimony of the Christian faith is that God is able. So he goes on and talks, and he says, at times, other forces cause us to question the ableness of God. The stark and colossal reality of evil in the world, what Keats calls the giant agony of the world, ruthless floods and tornadoes that wipe away people as though they were weeds in an open field, ills like insanity plaguing some individuals from birth and reducing their days to tragic cycles of meaninglessness, the madness of war and the barbarity of man's inhumanity to man. Why, we ask, do these things occur if God is able to prevent them? This problem, namely the problem of evil, has always plagued the mind of man. I would limit my response to an assertion that much of the evil we experience is caused by man's folly and ignorance, and also by the misuse of his freedom. Beyond this, I can say only that there is and always will be a penumbra of mystery surrounding God. What appears at the moment to be evil may have a purpose that our finite minds are incapable of comprehending. So in spite of the presence of evil and the doubts that lurk in our minds, we shall wish not to surrender the conviction that our God is able. Now, I could have picked something which was much more, shall we say, ringingly positive and ringingly irrefutable. But I chose to pick that passage because the issue involved is why fight evil? Why fight evil? And if you're looking at what is unfolding on the floor of the Congress today, it's an interesting thing to reflect upon. I'm not going to say anything about the particulars of it. I don't think that this is the time to do it, and I don't think we need to do that. I think that Gerry's presentation will cause us to be positioned such that when we get to the question and answers period, whatever questions people may have, either about the ongoing war or how and if we actually played a central role in this declaration of a truce, Christmas truce, or what prospects there are for taking back the government of the United States. Whatever those questions are, they need to be asked from a certain context, a certain vantage point. And the 10 principles that Helga Larouche has written, and she's been asking for a discussion of that, as we've been trying to do each of these last weeks, are that vantage point. We're trying to get people to climb up to that mountaintop, and then from their view, the general panorama of history. So at this point, let me turn this over to Gerry, and then we'll get to questions and answers. Okay, Gerry?
Yeah, sure. Well, Helga, we had an intensive discussion with Helga, I believe, on Monday, which I want to let you in on because it really poses in the most stark way what we would call the central irony or paradox of this situation. Now, what we were discussing the different intelligence and this and that. And what she was clear, and she provoked a very intensive discussion, was, there are a lot of people, it's obvious that Russia did not cause this situation. That's obvious. But she said to us, we cannot choose sides. Now that is quite a statement, right? We cannot choose sides. Because there is no way within the context of the British trap and the proxy war you can solve the problem. In other words, if Russia so-called wins, and Putin is, people misunderstand what Putin's actually doing here. He's doing exactly what he said. He's going to protect the Russian-speaking citizens from a Nazi regime. That's what he's doing. He does not want to run Ukraine. He does not want to invade Kiev. But if people say, well, Russia is going to win it because the West is so evil and they do this and that, well, frankly, that won't happen, because that will not end anything, because NATO will not let it end there. So that cannot be the solution. And therefore, by choosing sides, it's obvious on one level, but by choosing sides, you're thinking wrong. Because the question on the table, which the nuclear war question, and I'm going to go through it in a slightly different way than I did last week, the nuclear war issue. And I'll tell you, I got really excited this morning. I haven't gotten a chance to read it, but I got a book by Lilienthal that says Change, Hope, and the Bomb. And I read a little bit of the preface, and he was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission and the purveyor of the TVA, and one of the most intelligent men in the really genius inside the Roosevelt administration. And the book is about the scientific potential of the atom. And he was in the middle of it, and he knows what the issues are. So that the actual, we were confronted in the most insane way in the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We were presented with, and if you think it through, which is why Helga, has made a fundamental breakthrough, but puts her on the level of Eisenhower and Kennedy, and of course Lynn. Because when you think this problem through, as Kennedy does in the famous American University speech, you realize we are facing something that mankind has never faced before. It's a new physical principle. That's what it is. And the idea that you can somehow orient toward that in the same way you used to think, in terms of winning wars, losing wars, doing other things, which of course Roosevelt was clear on, you cannot conceive of it that way. You must go to what Helga has been insisting upon, the Cusanus idea of the coincidence of opposites. Because look, Eisenhower understood, as we discussed, as 6 months after Roosevelt died, we talked about this cabinet meeting. And they said, we cannot have a nuclear arms race. And these were conservatives. It wasn't Wallace, right? We cannot. And Roosevelt spent, Stalin was not a great guy. I mean, don't get it wrong. He was not a great guy. Roosevelt denounced him voluminously. But the circumstances and the implications of the World War II and the aftermath, which put this problem in total focus, Eisenhower understood we have to end the Cold War. We have to work where we can work on atoms for peace. Kennedy does it in a different way. But and then Kennedy was confronted in the most sensuous way with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he came up with, and his brother came up with a call for a new paradigm. I just want to reiterate certain critical elements. This is not a speech in the sense of a rhetorical flourish or verbiage. This is something he had to come to grips with, because if you honestly think what nuclear annihilation of everything on this planet, and as somebody pointed out to me today, if you annihilate everything on this planet, including the atmosphere, including all life, the biosphere, well, doesn't that change the configuration of the solar system? And wouldn't that have implications for the solar system? So you cannot walk away from that problem. Because if you do, given the breakdown crisis of the West and the absolute madness of NATO and the people who run it, what you're dealing with here is a completely different type of problem, in which the question of everyone being a world citizen is put front and center. So you're dealing with a new physical principle which you have to master, which means the set of social relationships in mastering that new physical principle must drive you to a higher hypothesis. And I'm just going to indicate, I'm not going to read the whole thing like I did not the whole thing, but I'm just going to get at certain critical points. because what Kennedy is calling for, which he knows in his own gut, is the only way you can solve this problem is to get people to think differently. Because any other solution is not thinkable. So, what does he say? I have therefore chosen this time, American University, and this place, because these are going to be the new diplomats of the United States, to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived. And that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean? What kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. Then he goes on. He says, first, examine our attitude toward peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many of us think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man. And man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe we can do it again. And then I want to go to the critical insight. There is no simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. You see, and of course, as I said, this question that Kennedy got at in a very fundamental way and had mobilized the nation, because which I'll get to in the end. But Kennedy was, and we discussed it in the Q&A, had the quality of a poet, as did Lincoln, as did Martin Luther King. But we'll get to that in a different context. Because I want to present now this question of the just a simple demonstration of Kuz's idea of the coincidence of opposites. What does it really mean? It's not a dialectic where the same and other and clash and you get something new. It's nothing like that. in the doctrine of the learned ignorance, right from the very beginning, Cusa demonstrates that the absolute maximum and the absolute minimum are the same thing. Completely defies logic, completely defies sense certainty, and in the church that he was dealing with, any Aristotelian idea that a thing cannot be the same and its opposite at the same time. And what Cusa demonstrated, I'm just giving you a little taste of the power of the doctrine of the learned ignorance, right from the very beginning. Well, ask yourself the question. The absolute maximum must also contain the absolute minimum. Because if it didn't contain the absolute minimum, then it wouldn't be the absolute maximum. Because there's something it wouldn't contain. Secondly, the absolute minimum, if it was the absolute minimum, if it didn't contain the absolute maximum, it wouldn't be the absolute minimum. So here is a coincidence of opposites. And Cusa, I've read all 1,500 pages of several times of his philosophy. I do it every morning. But it puts you in a different state of mind. It denies you the principle of sense certainty. Because you can always, by addition, make something larger. You can always, by subtraction, make something smaller. So the absolute maximum and the absolute minimum cannot be a number or cannot be a thing, because it precedes anything within that manifold. And we're talking about the universe itself. Every idea, every thought, every action as a single totality can only be contained within the absolute maximum and the absolute minimum, which is not, which precedes and creates through actions which I'm not going to go through, which Cusa does in the learned ignorance. So that the power of the human mind is a reflection, because we're part of the universe, is a reflection, is Imago Dei. And the Viva we're going to get to. And that out of the dark age, which we talked about Joan of Arc, what she hypothesized, what she changed. We talked about Louis XI. We talked in general about the great genius of Franklin Roosevelt and Kennedy. And what Helga and the Schiller Institute and Diane and the what Ramsey Clark call the fertile engine of ideas of the greatest genius of not only our century, but in my view of all time, Lyndon Larouche, to generate the necessary hypothesis, which is a reflection of the absolute power or ableness, as Dennis indicated, the ableness of any human problem to be solved by the hypothesis, which is a reflection of the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, which we'll get to, which is the question of the Creator. That power exists within us. And what Lynn does in the famous Jesus and Civilization, he first starts with the obvious point. We were faced, he wrote it in 2000, we were faced with the prospects of an Al Gore or Bush Jr. presidency. And Lynn said simply, I know how to negotiate to get us out of this thing. Whether it'll be done or not, I don't know. But the fact that this oligarchy has chosen these two clowns means they intend something horrible for us. Now, I can get you out of this thing, but how do we solve the problem of why we got into this thing in the first place? How can you actually think about that? Because on a deeper level, on the deepest level, in fact, the question of Imago Dei, which is the basis upon which all fundamental strategic considerations must be subsumed under, you cannot solve the problem for, you may get past a problem, but you cannot solve the problem on the level it has to be solved. And in Jesus Christ and Civilization, Lynn takes up the most fundamental question of civilization, which in the Renaissance it was called the filioque, and we know the impact of that debate, which Cusa ran at the Council of Florence, and the reignition of Plato in the original, which Cusa brought back from Constantinople at the Council of Florence, and then later in Ficino's Academy, the Platonic Academy, they retranslated it, they taught it, and it had an enormous impact, such that the relative potential population density, the impact of the Renaissance, was that the relative potential population density increased in an exponential rate, such that mankind has reached 8 billion, and we know we can go orders of magnitude above that. Therefore, this fundamental question of the nature of man and the nature of man as Imago Dei, Imago Dei, is the core question of civilization. It may be expressed in different ways, in different religions, in different rites, but that is the issue. Now, how does Lynn take this on? And he takes it on, he says, look, there are three nodal points. One is, of course, the Greek from Homer to Plato, and the kind of what Lynn called the idea of idea, which is fleshed out in an unbelievable way by Plato later, but Homer, others, Aeschylus, others, the idea of idea, or metaphor, if you will, right? And now this question of Jesus Christ and civilization is you've heard a lot about it, and Lynn takes it on. We had this mess in the organization when a bunch of pseudo-Christians calling themselves Catholics, which they never were really, tried to give us doctrine and homilies and doctrines, and which was never the mission of Christ. Lynn calls it, and it's very clear, and I'm going to make a point of this. Lynn calls it the ministry of Christ and the crucifixion. The ministry of Christ and the crucifixion. Because what he points out in St. John's Gospel according to St. John, is that Christ was both on earth, on this planet, in this manifold, and he was with God simultaneously, which would seem a mystery. How could he be with God from the beginning and always? And it's called the idea of temporal eternity. Temporal eternity. So there is a very powerful paradox about that idea. He was with God from the beginning and always, and was God. The Word, the Logos, was God. And he was in our time. Now, in the section of this piece, and you really have to work this through, in the section of the piece which he calls Economy and Theology, he does something absolutely stunning. The core, as Lynn's unique contribution to economic science, or at least in terms of its clarity and profundity, is that mankind reproduces itself on the basis of fundamental discovery of universal physical principles. Discovery and application. But that discovery cannot come from the senses. Your senses cannot, by logical formulation, by Aristotelian logic, or by Euclidean geometry, or any other approach, your senses cannot tell you what the universe is like. It's cognitive. You discover things cognitively. You also have to convey something, a discovery, with the use of a language that doesn't exist. because the act of reproduction of mankind is a social process. So therefore, the discovery and the communication of that discovery, the discovery is made in the sovereign boundary of each of an individual. Now, it may come out of a dialogue and forcing that, but the actual aha moment must occur as an act of cognition inside the individual. And that act of cognition has to be communicated through means of what we call classical art, poetry in particular. What poetry means, the different methodologies of conveying discovery. The impact of that process puts man in relationship to the universe as a reflection of the Creator himself. As a reflection. But it also puts man in relationship to mankind because his actions are changing the course of life for all of mankind. So it puts him directly in a relationship to all of mankind. And the communication of that is based upon a passion for truth, a quality of agape, which Leibniz indicates is the quality that the Creator, the reason he created is because of the passion for the good. Because it's more beautiful. It's not necessity, it's more beautiful. It's more profound. It's more beautiful. And that passion transcends life itself. Think of Shelley's point about the poet. He called them the unacknowledged legislators for mankind. What Shelley, and he said they were the hierophants, they were the instrument of a higher power. Now think about what actually happened with Kennedy's discovery on this question of peace. He was a poet, and he touched deeply the people of this country. You couldn't lie to them about Kennedy. You could try, but you couldn't. You couldn't take away their sense of identity and mission. He had tapped something deeply through that and the space program and the commitment to the future for all mankind. This is how we are created as a species. So they couldn't stop it by lying. They couldn't stop it by drugs and other things. So they assassinated him. Lincoln, poet. What did they have to do? King, poet. What did they have to do? Because they touched on the deepest level our very nature And when we say Imago Dei, a living God, Dietrich Bonhoeffer discussed this in very great detail. This question of Joan of Arc, they represent the unstoppable capability of mankind at the deepest level. And Lyndon Larouche has shaped this century. This century, you see it with Helga and Lynn. They have shaped this century at the deepest level. And now we have to use that genius to win the United States to its mission. But from that standpoint.